Okay, we're going to start with chapter 9. 9 opens up with really the basis for the rest of the chapter. It is all about oxidation and reduction reactions. And the reason why this is the basis for the rest of the chapter is that let's talk about life in general, right? So we already kind of know that cells require energy in order to do work. And some of this work may be assembling polymers like proteins and carbohydrates, transport across the membrane. Remember, energy is required to transport molecules and ions against the concentration gradient. And then, of course, the cell needs to move in some cases, right? So some cells have flagella, some cells have cilia, some cells use pseudopodia to move. And then, of course, moving things inside the cell requires some energy. And then, of course, reproduction requires energy as well. Now, animals obtain energy from feeding on other animals and plants, right? So photosynthetic organisms. So remember, photosynthetic organisms they're autotrophs. They can produce their own food. Now, they produce their own food in terms of sugars, and then they store those sugars, and then animals eat it. And then, so animals must be able to break down these sugars and extract the energy that's stored in these sugars, like glucose. So this kind of represents the relationship between those animals and the plants, right? And other organisms, which kind of depend on plants for food. Plants, of course, photosynthesis is going to be the subject of chapter 10, but just to kind of overview, right? So photosynthesis is basically the process of using light energy and converting it to chemical energy. So what that means is that those things that can photosynthesize, they can absorb light energy, and they use the energy from that light in order to make sugars like glucose. So this occurs in the cytoplasm or in the chloroplast. And, those organisms that can photosynthesize can do that. Now, during the process of photosynthesis, oxygen is released. And then, of course, organic molecules are made. Now, this oxygen that's released into the atmosphere is used by those organisms that need oxygen, right? So the oxygen is taken in by, let's say, animals that have mitochondria. Well, plants also have mitochondria, so they can undergo cellular respiration. However, animals really kind of depend on that for extracting energy out of the food that they eat. So here, animals are going to take in these organic molecules and take in oxygen, and then what's going to happen is it's going to be processed, and the energy from that is going to be extracted from those organic molecules, producing ATP in order to do work. And then, of course, energy can be transformed into heat energy, which isn't available to do work. So that's really one of the products of work. Heat energy, or that type of energy, is lost to the environment, really. So during the process of cellular respiration, carbon dioxide and water is produced. And the plants can actually, or those things that can photosynthesize, take in carbon dioxide. So how do they make these organic molecules? Well, they can take in a gas, a carbon-containing gas, and then convert it to a solid. This is called carbon fixation. So, catabolic pathways, remember, are those pathways that actually release energy. They release energy by oxidizing organic molecules. Now, these are exergonic processes. Remember what exergonic means? It's a chemical reaction that doesn't require energy. It releases energy. And during this process, catabolic pathways, electron transfer is really at the center of it all. Okay, so electrons are transferred between molecules, and it's the electrons that help provide that energy. Now, aerobic respiration is the process of extracting energy. It's a catabolic process which allows the extraction of energy from these organic molecules in the presence of oxygen. Okay, so this is why it's called aerobic. Okay, so that means oxygen is required. Now that's opposed to those things that do not require oxygen. One of those things that doesn't require oxygen is fermentation. Right? So fermentation can happen in the absence of oxygen or when there's very low amounts of oxygen present. Then there's anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic respiration is really the direct opposite, almost the direct opposite of aerobic respiration in terms of oxygen, right? So anaerobic respiration operates in the absence of oxygen. However, fermentation is a type of anaerobic respiration, I guess, if you will. It's not really respiration because it doesn't produce a whole lot of ATP. Anaerobic respiration does produce a lot of ATP in most cases, very similar to aerobic respiration, except in anaerobic respiration, oxygen is not the final electron acceptor. Now, all of these together make up cellular respiration. So cellular respiration includes both aerobic and anaerobic respiration. So it's all combined. Okay, so often cellular respiration is described as aerobic respiration, but it really doesn't mean the same thing. Cellular respiration includes anaerobic respiration. Now, let's go ahead and look in terms of the overall chemical equation for the respiration of glucose. So your chapter kind of concentrates on studies. We're going to study aerobic respiration. However, we're going to look at it in terms of the breakdown of glucose in detail, and then we'll talk about the breakdown of other things near the end. So here, this is the net reaction for cellular respiration, or aerobic respiration in terms of glucose. So we have glucose, C6H12O6, plus oxygen. So we have organic molecules plus oxygen. Now we have a whole bunch of chemical reactions that happen in between here. And then what's released? Okay, so carbon dioxide is released. So you can see all the carbons that are in the glucose are released as carbon dioxide. And then, of course, water is produced because we have oxygen combined with some of the hydrogens from glucose. And then energy, and then of course heat, because there is some work being done during this process. So we're going to talk about this whole thing in steps for this chapter. All right, so like I said, electron transfer is basically at the center of it all. And electron transfer is done by what's called redox reactions. And it stands for reduction and oxidation. Okay, so redox, reduction, oxidation. Often it's just said the other way around, oxidation and reduction. Right? So oxidation and reduction reactions are those reactions which involve electron transfer. Now, redox, right? So we have oxidation is where something loses electrons. Okay, so when something loses its electrons, it becomes oxidized. It also serves as the reducing agent because when oxidation happens, reduction also happens. They happen together. Okay, so they're coupled together. So whenever there's oxidation, there's also reduction. So when something becomes oxidized, it's actually a reducing agent because it reduces something else. How does it reduce something else? The electrons from the substance that lost the electrons is going to be added to the substance that gains electrons. So the substance that gains electrons is called, well, when it gains electrons, it's called reduction. So the substance that gains electrons is becoming reduced, so it serves as the oxidizing agent because it's basically taking those electrons from the substance that's losing them. So it serves as an oxidizing agent. Let's look at some examples. Okay, so you're probably familiar with this one, right? So remember, sodium plus chlorine makes sodium chloride, right? So it forms these ions. Remember ionic attractions and the formation of ions. So here we have a cation and then we have an anion. Well, what is actually happening here is we have sodium here. Okay, it loses an electron. Remember, chlorine steals that electron from sodium. Okay, so it loses an electron. Because it loses an electron, it becomes oxidized. Then chlorine, because it gains that electron, it becomes reduced. So you can see they're coupled together. Oxidation, reduction. Both of them happen together. They must. All right. So here we have just in general terms, right? So let's say X and Y are just any substance. And X has an electron, which it's going to lose. Okay, so whatever X is, it could lose this electron and then it becomes oxidized. Well, when X loses the electron, Y gains that electron. So then Y is said to become reduced. Now the molecule or substance that becomes oxidized, remember, that serves as the reducing agent. And the substance that becomes reduced serves as the oxidizing agent. Let's look at one where we're dealing with organic. Okay, so we have methane, plus we have oxygen, and then we have this chemical reaction which converts the methane to carbon dioxide and water, and then of course energy is released during this process. It is a catabolic process. Now, looking at terms of electrons, okay, so look, this really isn't obvious because it's not like gaining a negative charge, but we can look in terms of the electrons. So in methane, remember the electronegativity, right? So this is coming back to haunt you now. We have the carbon and hydrogen, they have equal electronegativity. So the electrons are going to be distributed evenly between the atoms in methane. Same thing with oxygen, right? So oxygen, yes, it has a high electronegativity, but when it's combined with another oxygen, they have equal electronegativities so that the electrons are going to be hanging out exactly in between them. Okay, so there'll be an even distribution of electrons. Well, what happens here is when methane becomes oxidized, it loses those electrons. Really, the carbon is kind of losing the electrons. So when we look at carbon dioxide in the structure, right, so we have carbon and then we have double bonds to each of these oxygens. Remember, oxygen is more electronegative than carbon. So whatever electrons are being shared between oxygen and carbon are going to be hanging out closer to the oxygen. So really that carbon is kind of losing those electrons in this case. Now look at water, right? So now we have water formation. Again, the electrons are going to be hanging out closer to oxygen than they do hydrogen. Now another way to look at this is how are you going to know what becomes reduced and what becomes oxidized? Well, the thing that becomes reduced gains more hydrogens. Okay, so look, we can see that oxygen, it starts out with just oxygen atoms, and then it's combined with more hydrogens. So this oxygen has gained hydrogens. So then you can say that it's become reduced. Okay, so whenever you see an increase in hydrogens after a chemical reaction, often that molecule becomes reduced, and then the other one must become oxidized. So that's a good little trick to remember. Look at the oxidation of glucose. Okay, so we have glucose plus oxygen makes carbon dioxide, water, and energy. We already saw this. So we could say that glucose becomes oxidized. Okay, so it's losing electrons. So it's losing those hydrogens, look. Okay, and what's gaining the hydrogens? We have oxygen. Oxygen is gaining hydrogen, so it becomes reduced. So we can kind of look at it that way. We don't need to draw out the skeleton structures to be able to determine where the electrons are in terms of electron distribution and electronegativity. We can track the hydrogens. Okay, so look, hydrogens are lost in glucose, they are gained with oxygen. So glucose is losing hydrogens or losing electrons, it becomes oxidized. And then we have oxygen, it gains electrons or gains hydrogens, it becomes reduced. Okay, so during the process of aerobic respiration, we're dealing with the oxidation of glucose. Now let's look at just a general reaction. So here we've got this part of a molecule, and then we have this molecule right here, NAD+. And then we have this enzyme. So anytime you see ASE at the end, I think I mentioned this from chapter 8, that means it's an enzyme. This is called a dehydrogenase. So dehydrogenase enzymes are very important. They participate in, or they help catalyze oxidation reduction reactions. So we're going to see a lot of dehydrogenases during this process of aerobic respiration. Now, NAD is a molecule, look, it's got this plus sign, and it gains a hydrogen, so it becomes reduced. So this must be the oxidized form of NAD. And then if this becomes reduced, then this molecule must become oxidized. So this is kind of analogous to the oxidation of glucose. Remember, glucose has a lot of these hydroxyl groups. Okay, so it's going to lose that hydrogen right there. That hydrogen is going to be added to NAD, and now we have this double bond formed here. So this becomes oxidized, and then this becomes reduced. A dehydrogenase, often in a form of a complex, are part of this process. Now let's look a little bit more at this process. Now, NAD is kind of important. It's a molecule that stores energy in the form of electrons, right? So it's an electron carrier. So it carries electrons to what's called the electron transport chain. Now, this is done in a series of steps. It's broken down in a series of steps in order to build up a concentration gradients. Remember concentration gradients, which drive the process of ATP synthesis. So NAD is actually a coenzyme. Remember, we talked about this, the difference between cofactors and coenzymes. It's a coenzyme. Remember, a coenzyme is an organic cofactor. Just a general cofactor is usually inorganic. So it's usually some sort of ion like iron or magnesium or even sodium. Now, this serves as the oxidizing agent. Remember, it becomes reduced, right? So it becomes reduced to NADH, okay, during the process of the breakdown of glucose or the oxidation of glucose. So again, this stores energy, okay, which will then bring that energy in the form of electrons to the electron transport chain in order to make a lot of ATP. Now let's look at the structure of NAD. Okay, so this is the structure of NAD. We can see that the structure of NAD is quite complex. It has some phosphates, it's got a couple sugars, it's got a nitrogenous base, but then here, right here, we have this nicotinamide. The nicotinamide end is the business end of this, okay? This is where the oxidation reduction reaction occurs. So this is NAD+. This is the oxidized form of NAD. Let's look at the... Okay, so we have the oxidized form here. Now, we've got hydrogens from the breakdown of food. These hydrogens are going to be combined with electrons to NAD+ to form NADH, which reduces NAD+ to NADH. Again, a dehydrogenase enzyme complex is going to be what catalyzes these types of chemical reactions. So again, oxidation and reduction occur together. The reduction of NAD+ occurs, and then it could go in the opposite direction, right? So once the reduction of NAD+ occurs, it forms NADH. This NADH is basically storing electrons. Once these electrons get dropped off at the electron transport chain, then this NADH becomes reoxidized back to the oxidized form, which is NAD+. We'll talk about this a little bit more as we go through the steps of aerobic respiration. Now, this kind of shows it all together. Now we have the structure of NAD. Like I said, this is the business end. Okay, so this business end converts from this to this and back again. So let's talk about the electron transport chain in general. The details will be covered when we get to that section. Now, the electron transport chain is a controlled set of steps. Like I said, it's done in a stepwise fashion. If it was not done in a stepwise fashion, it would be like a large explosion of energy and a lot of energy. This would generate too much heat. Okay, so it would generate a lot more heat if it was done in one step. And then remember, heat, okay, it's a form of energy that cannot be used to do work. So that would be inefficient. It would make it less efficient. So what happens is the oxygen, remember, we're talking about aerobic respiration, the oxygen pulls the electrons. Remember, oxygen is attracted to electrons. It's very electronegative. It pulls those electrons down the electron transport chain, creating energy. Okay, so this creates more energy in a stepwise fashion. So let's compare that with a design that we've seen before. Is going to be used to make ATP. So remember, we have free energy, okay, and then the process of the progress of the reaction. Now, this would be an uncontrolled reaction. Okay, so this, let's say, one step. Okay, so if this happened all in one step, this would basically generate a lot of heat and be more like an explosion, right? So again, it's going to be one step, but it's going to be very inefficient in terms of the generation of ATP. And then so there's going to be less free energy to do work present. Now, what the electron transport chain actually occurs like is it's in steps. Okay, so the electrons are transported from one complex to another, building up energy, making ATP during this process in a stepwise fashion, which is controlled. Okay, so if you did not control it, it would be explosive and a lot of heat would be lost. When you do control it, it is not explosive, and all the ATP or the energy or most of the energy is going to be maintained in order to make the ATP. So what happens is oxygen is the final electron acceptor, so it accepts electrons in the form of protons plus electrons to make water. This is review of what we're going to be discussing. So I kind of introduced you to redox reaction. We're going to see a whole lot of examples of those. Remember, redox reaction stands for reduction, oxidation. Remember, they're coupled. Okay, so whenever something becomes oxidized, something else must become reduced. Whenever something becomes reduced, something else must become oxidized. And remember, NAD plus is that molecule which actually stores these electrons and then carries them to a very important step during aerobic respiration. That's called the electron transport chain. Okay, so NAD plus switches between NAD plus and NADH. Okay, so NAD plus is the oxidized form, NADH is the reduced form. Now, this isn't the only electron carrier. We're going to see another example when we get to the citric acid cycle. All right, thank you for listening.